Class, this is part one of chapter 13 on family. There will be two videos covering the three parts of chapter 13. This first video will focus largely on definitions and provide a broad overview of the social institution of family. And then the second video will discuss some of the changes that we've seen in the family institution. Some of those changes people perhaps would identify as being problems. So we begin with the Census Bureau definition of family, which is a group of two people or more, one of whom is the householder, related by birth, marriage, or adoption, and residing together. Now, people have some people have some complaints with this definition because there are certain types of families that are perhaps left out of this definition. So take a look and see if you can figure out who would be left out. Okay, so perhaps some of the people or some of the families that would consider themselves to be families, but the Census Bureau definition would not cover them, would be things like a cohabiting couple, a group of friends who consider each other to be like family and live together and share expenses. Before Obergefell Hodges, where gay marriage was recognized nationwide, frequently families that were headed by a gay couple were not recognized in previous censuses by this Census Bureau definition. Now, if you do not meet the Census Bureau definition of family, they do have an alternative, which is household, and that's all people who occupy a housing unit. Not the same thing. So uh, the term household, when used by the census, is not synonymous with the term family. They actually can refer to two very different living situations. For instance, single people are, by definition, always considered to be a household, but not a family. And so, from this kind of definition of a family, the group of two people or more related by birth, marriage, or adoption and residing together, we can kind of look to our first set of sociological definitions. The first of which is nuclear family. And the nuclear family is this kind of traditional family unit where there are two married adults that have dependent children living in that household. And for a lot of people, the expectation is that you will have two different types of nuclear families in your lifetime. That you will have your family of origin, the nuclear family you are born into. If you are adopted, then instead of a family of origin, we might say that you have a family of orientation, the nuclear family you are raised in, as opposed to born into. And then later in life, you are expected to have your family of procreation, the nuclear family that you yourself create by by getting married and becoming a parent. Now, outside of this nuclear family model, there are other types of family and family members. What we might be most aware of are the people that we call extended family. And so these are people who we are related to primarily by birth and marriage. But these are people outside of that nuclear unit. So this would be people like your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, your cousins. All of them would be considered extended family. And then we have affiliated kin. And, depending on your family, you might do a better or a worse job kind of keeping track of this type of family. But affiliated kin would be people that like marry into your family. Your cousin's husband or wife. Or people who are adopted by other family members. So, yeah, if your aunt, adopts a child, or people who are married and or divorced and remarried by people in your extended family, all would kind of come under this affiliated kin. They are related to you through that birth, marriage, or adoption. But once again, it goes beyond those kind of nuclear family, close family ties. And then finally, we have fictive kin. These are people who aren't really related to you in the sense of, you don't have a relationship with them through birth, marriage, or adoption, but these might be people who feel like family. So if you have someone in your life that's like a second mom, or if you and your best friend are so close you refer to each other as like brothers or like sisters. um, in sociology, we call those people fictive kin, and we acknowledge that just because they are not necessarily family in this kind of traditionally defined way doesn't mean that they aren't family in kind of an emotional attachment type of way. And that really just kind of emphasizes a big point I want to make here, is that the sociological definition of family and your textbook definition, it does kind of fall in line with that. Um, it kind of goes beyond the census definition, because instead of emphasizing the ways in which a person who is um, how a person is related to you, it also kind of emphasizes that family are people who identify themselves as being family, and that maybe more important than whether they are related by blood, marriage, or adoption is the idea that they care for one another, they share intimate relationships, and they are dependent upon one another. And so, in this way, sometimes families might identify themselves as such, but the census does not necessarily share that definition. And so, it's just worth considering, which of these examples would be a family according to the census definition, which of these would be considered families according to like the textbook slash sociological definition. Same sex couples with adopted children, childless cohabiting couples, foster parents with foster children, elderly siblings who reside together, and then always the wild card, roommates. Because the extent to which roommates can feel like family has a lot to do with what type of roommates are we talking about. Are we talking about roommates like, the old TV show Friends, where you can make that argument that they identify as family, they care for one another, they have a certain level of dependency and intimacy with one another? Or are we talking about like the roommate that you find off of like Craigslist, and you barely speak and you leave passive aggressive notes on the fridge? Obviously, that person does not meet the definition of being family, and neither one of you probably see yourself as being family. Um, so just know that there isn't a concrete definition around the topic of roommates. They can be like family, like fictive kin, or they could just be a stranger that you are sharing bills with temporarily. And so there is this debate over definitions, and this debate has become more heated in recent years because we have a broader and more inclusive idea of what being a family means. And so, whether it's single parenthood, or people choosing to be child free, or as I've already mentioned, same sex couples, at least in sociology, we have embraced in our definition this idea that people can be families largely just because they identify themselves as being families. And we call that families of affinity, people who feel they belong together and define themselves as being a family. And if that's how you feel about the people in your household, the people you consider to be family, for the most part, sociologists kind of honor that self identification, more so than maybe the census and the more narrow census definition does. And so, why do we have families? One big thing is this is part of how we reproduce, our community and citizenry. Your children are born into families, and families are responsible for the care and the socialization of young people, and your family is your primary socialization agent. It's where you first learn about the culture that you're born into and what is expected of you in that culture, the social structure of that society, what roles you will go on to take and play in larger society as you get older. All of that occurs, at least initially, within the context of family. It isn't just the care of the young, however. Families also provide care related to the elderly, as people are no longer able to work in the labor force, and then perhaps at some point also get to the point where they can no longer, run their own household, take care of themselves. Families help provide care for the elderly as well as the young. Families contribute to the economy as consumers. We know that there are some consumption patterns that are much more likely there when people live in family units versus in single households. Families are much more likely to buy homes. There are certain foodstuffs and furnitures and types of cars, even, that market really only exists because we live in families. There would not be a lot of need for minivans, for instance, if we lived in a society where, people largely were single and childless. That's just one example. And certainly, even stores like Costco and Sam's Club, those big box stores, that largely makes sense only in the context of, people shop for families, these larger kind of family units, versus smaller single households. And then finally, the allocation of social roles. Our kind of development of gender roles has gone hand in hand with our development of the social roles. What roles do we see mothers and fathers playing? The kind of changing roles that we see grandparents playing. All of these things kind of relate to other social roles that exist out in society, those related not just to gender, but those related to work, those related to leisure. All of these kind of are entangled with how we kind of define familial roles. And so, all of this, of course, and we've have indicated, the fact that things have changed. Our definitions of families have changed over time, the structure of families, the familial roles, what we expect of mothers and fathers. And so this is just a kind of a brief overview of families, some kind of major themes of, in regards to families in the past, and then we'll end with a kind of discussion of families now, and then that is going to be the primary focus of video two, is really focusing on what's going on, what are some of these kind of primary changes that we see in families now. But in order for that to make sense, let's just very quickly just kind of knock out what families used to be. So pre-industrial as well as agricultural era families were, first of all, social and economic units, meaning that the families themselves operated as businesses, as farms, primarily, and they were usually much larger. There were multiple generations. They had a lot of children because there was a high rate of infant mortality, not to mention your children helped. They provided economic assistance at a much younger age. So people had much bigger families. And divorce was almost unheard of. Marriage was enduring, and a lot of these marriages were not necessarily based on love, but were strategic, and once again, usually related to the economic necessity of getting married, of partnering with, another local family. These families and marriages practiced could be considered property patriarchal marriage. Women were considered to be the property of their husbands, and husbands were the uh, undisputed head of the household. And we can further see this through the practice of something called coverture. And that's basically in under coverture, uh, married women were considered to be under their husband's protection and authority. They couldn't own any property in their own name. Any property that they had became their husband's property upon marriage. Now, during the industrialization, urbanization era, we saw families shrink because at this point, children became more of a cost rather than a wage earning benefit. And this was especially true once laws were passed that limited the use of child labor, that passed, um, minimum working age laws. So at this point, it did not make a lot of sense, for instance, to have like 15 children because they were going to cost you money as opposed to posing any economic benefit. We see the development during this time of the concept of separate spheres, as opposed to men and women being an economic team working on like the farm or the family business together. Now you have the concept of women staying at home and the home being their domain, and the home no longer being kind of a money generating economic kind of space, as opposed to now men leaving the home and going out and working, whether it was in a factory or somewhere else, but working for a wage. Um, and maybe because now the home is no longer economic space, although some marriages during this time were still strategic, and divorce was still not uh, not common, although it was a little bit more common than what it was in the time period before it. We do see the rise of companionate marriage. So the idea that instead of marriage kind of being this financial business that people rationally kind of consider and get into, that people are now looking for a companion. That love and emotion is now becoming more of a driving force behind these decisions. And 1940s and 1950s, so this is during the kind of World War II era. um, we kind of start to see the rise of dating, and before dating there was calling, and calling happened at the home, usually the home of the woman. So it happened under the watchful eye of her parents, and it really kind of was like a group decision. But dating involved, like, what you consider to be dating now, picking someone up and going somewhere private. And so we do see a rise in premarital sex during this time period. Um, but we also see a decline in pregnancy outside of marriage. Um, Although it's worth noting that this might be also due to the fact that shotgun weddings were very much taking place because the nuclear family model, mother as homemaker, father as breadwinner, this really evolved to be the dominant model during this time period. And so the expectation definitely was that people would get married and that men would go off to work and women would stay home. And as we were enjoying that post World War II economic boom, this was made possible by a lot of employers offering what's called a family wage, where they paid men enough money that for that time period, it was expected that they could reasonably raise a family on that wage without their wife having to work. Now, it's worth noting that this is also the time period where we first start to see a major increase in divorce, and that's post World War II. And this could be related to both the rush nature of marriages that happened during World War II, as well as what we now know about kind of the mental state of veterans after serving, during wars. At the time, we knew nothing about PTSD. But certainly, in the same way that men and women who serve come back today, with PTSD. That had to be true in the past. We just didn't really have the language to talk about it. And certainly there were some marriages that ended because of this. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, as we begin, if you think about what was discussed in previous chapters about the economic shift and the beginning of deindustrialization and the rise of the information revolution, you see the disappearance of family wage. And although um, women were beginning to enter into college as well as other careers that had previously not been available to them, the concept of the stalled revolution became common. And the stalled revolution is the idea that because most women, heterosexual women, want to be married, that their own kind of personal work ambitions are going to be limited by the fact that if they marry partners who are not fully supportive of their work, of their careers, who are not comfortable perhaps letting their own careers take the back seat, that this is going to stall the ability of women to move into high powered positions, your CEOs, your surgeons, your judges, if they do not have male partners that truly support them while this is occurring. Because of course, part of what has allowed men to do this is that for so long, of course, women were not competing with men, and men did not have to worry about the home sphere because men and women had separate spheres. But now that that's no longer the case, um, for beginning with this generation of women, this stalled revolution started to kind of become a real problem. And it was during this time period that we have the beginning of the second wave feminism that, as we discussed previously in class, was kind of sparked by Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which talked about that middle class, like white woman discontent that was due to them being excluded and marginalized and therefore feeling unfulfilled. And so all of these types of changes and shifts kind of led to, where we are now, this kind of modern family, and the modern family really kind of being the term that we give all the kind of changes of the family that's happened from the late 1980s onward. And so today, the traditional nuclear family really only represents about 7% of the US households. And by traditional nuclear family, what I mean is mother who is fully a stay-at-home mother, married father who, is the sole worker provider in the family, and then their dependent children. Um, and this isn't to say that all the other family types are like single parent households, because although there are more children living with single parents than in the past, most children do still, in fact, live in two-parent households. Really, the major deviation away from that traditional nuclear family model has to do with work. The fact that in most families in America, uh, that both parents are working in some capacity. There are also more adults living in non-family households, whether that's as a single or an unrelated households, like the roommate situations that we started this video kind of talking about. Um, and so this increase of people who are living alone. And part of this is due to the fact that although people still indicate that they would like to marry, um, they are getting married later in life. And so these changes in the family structure can be met with a different kind of responses. But people who study this have kind of come up with a typology of three primary responses, and that's rejectors, acceptors, and skeptics. So rejectors pretty much see these changes that exist now in the modern family as being largely bad for society. These are the people that talk about the good old days and the way it used to be in my time. And they hold on to this very idealized kind of rosy view of the past. Acceptors are are open-minded, and actually believe that a lot of these changes are going to result in society being better, as it being good for society. That things like divorce, being more common. It means that people are like less likely to be stuck in abusive or unhappy marriages, which in the long run should result in children being happier. They're putting a positive spin on a lot of these changes, and they believe that these changes are going to be good for the families themselves as well as larger society. And then there's skeptics. Skeptics are like, they're open-minded, but they aren't really sure. Is it going to be good for society? Is it going to be bad for society? Does it really even make a difference beyond the individual families? So they're right there in the middle. And it's worth noting that, at least at the time that this like 2011, that this infographic was created, if you look at the people that they polled, they were pretty almost evenly split. I mean, there were almost the same number of rejectors and acceptors, and then skeptics were the most dominant, but only by a few percentage points. So, in a lot of ways, Americans aren't quite sure how they feel about these changes in family. And so we're going to have this discussion about all the ways in which families have changed, how the modern family has changed, in our next video. And, you know, we can see that we've had this change in family structure when we just look at the number of families in America, the number of the population that's married, never married, or divorced. And you can just see over the last like 60, 65 years, uh, all of these lines have shifted in some way. The number of percentage of people who are married has decreased. The percentage of people who are divorced has increased. The percentage of people who've never married has increased. And so this is just one of these changes that we're going to go into further discussion of in the next video.